through a really ambitious program, unprecedented study. I'm going to tell you about that. And also I've got data, it's not complete, but I've got some data which can show you how Malta compares and tells you how well it's preparing young people to be what we would call, more career ready. And you see they've got a project website there, loads of documents there, all freely available. Lots of studies and reports are deliberately written in very accessible language to make it easy for people, either in practice or in policy, to understand what we're doing, as well as the papers we've got with all the, the quantitative statistical studies. And you can follow me on Twitter at any time if you like. So firstly, I just want to sort of give a bit of a background here. Malta's the same as countries around the world. So in Malta, young people are more educated than ever before. And so we see here, this is the proportion of young people who are early school leavers. I stole this from a Central Bank of Malta paper. And you'll see between 2005, 2020, 15 years, as a really steady decline in the proportion of young adults who left school early in Malta. That's great. That's a real success of the Maltese education system. We also see a big growth in proportion over the same period, last 15 years, of young people who have tertiary education, who go to university or similar levels of education, doubled over the last 15 years. And Malta's not alone in this. In many, many countries, young people are more educated than ever before. But if we look at how competitive they are, for the jobs which are available, well, sometimes we can look at youth employment figures and youth unemployment figures. And the problem with those is that they really only measure sort of demand in the labour market. You might have very high youth unemployment, but if you have very high adult unemployment, and by youth, we're looking up to the age of 24, adult, 24 plus, we can say, well, there's just no demand in the labour market. But if we look at the ratio of youth to adult unemployment, this is how many times greater youth unemployment is than adult unemployment. It tells us something quite interesting about how competitive young people are for the jobs which are available. And sometimes it's nothing to do with young people and their preparation by schools. Sometimes it's to do with maybe minimum wages are set very high, or there's the nature of the economy doesn't really demand sort of like more lower skills, because young people tend to have lower skills than older people. But we see that Malta here sits in the middle. This is the latest figure I could find from 2018. In Malta, young people are 2.8, nearly 3 times more likely to be unemployed compared to older workers. And I think that's a figure which would be useful to look at over time. Is the ratio going down? That's what we want. We want to be more like Germany, where young people are much more competitive, much more attractive to employers for jobs are available. More like Germany, less like the UK or Poland, where young people face much higher levels of young unemployment. The thing about unemployment, this particular worry at the moment, is that because we have such a turbulent labour market because of the pandemic, and then before the pandemic, we were all worried, and we still are worried about the effects of digitalisation and automation on jobs. We kind of worry that young people are going to find it sort of like difficult, particularly if there's a recession, and we've got inflation going on, we've got the crisis in Ukraine, we don't know what's going to happen. But if you look back to the last recession, the great financial crisis, we saw that in many countries, it was young people who really suffered, and they were particularly vulnerable during a recession. And that happened in Malta. The level of youth unemployment rose, from 11% to nearly 15%, and stayed that high for nearly 6 years. And this is a particular worry. This is why now is a very good time to think about, whether our school systems are really preparing young people as well as they possibly can. Because we kind of see, this is kind of the argument, really for why career guidance can be seen as more important than ever before, is that, in Malta, as elsewhere, young people are staying in education for longer than ever. And because they stay in education, they've got more decisions to make than ever before. And those decisions are becoming more difficult because the labour market is becoming more turbulent, and often continuing education in some countries, not all countries, is more marketised. And so it's more difficult to make those decisions in front of a dynamic labour market. And we know the costs are very high, because if young people have a poor entry into the labour market, we see what the economists call them being scarred later on. They're, over a long period of time, they earn less than we'd expect. They face more psychological, damages than problems than we'd expect. And, so I argue often that never before in human history has career guidance been so important. And that's partly because of this argument about staying in education longer, more decisions to make, decisions being more difficult. But the evidence has never been stronger that career guidance works. And this is how this is what we've been doing to try and demonstrate that, to find out whether it really does work. We needed to use longitudinal data. And so longitudinal data is seen as being particularly reliable, perhaps the most reliable information that you can get. We need to follow students over time to see if they do better in work than if they hadn't had the guidance, which they got. And we need to take into account the characteristics that typically influence how well people do in work. So you need to have lots of information about their gender, their academic achievement, their social background, their geographic location, and so on. And we look to see if we can find relationships between what they did at school and what happens to them 10 years later. Do they do better than we'd expect, than if they hadn't had the intervention, after we control statistically for all these different characteristics? And longitudinal surveys are very valuable because they follow large numbers of children into adulthood. They get interviewed very regularly. They fill in questionnaires at very regular intervals, and we have this information about the wider characteristics. And this is what we did in our career readiness work. There's not a lot of these data sets available, so we used the ones which were available, and we found them in 10 countries, and some questionnaires are brilliant. Australia and Canada have got fantastic questionnaires. Other ones are more limited. The one in China and South Korea didn't ask as many questions as we wanted, but we used what we had. First, we did a literature review, and this is not completely new. We can other people looked at longitudinal data to see relationships before, but nobody's really done a comprehensive piece of work on this. And we identified 14 potential career-related experiences and attitudes, typically measured at 15, which had seen in at least some studies to have positive impacts later on. And we looked to see if we could find significant relationships between participation in these activities or attitudes and lower levels of unemployment, what we call NEETs, high wages, greater job satisfaction. And the last one's important because it's not all about earnings. It's about young people's happiness in work and in their adulthood. And then we integrated our new findings into the existing literature. And so you don't need to spend much time on this, but these are the studies which you looked at. You'll see here that they're all old, and that's inevitable. Because we need to find out what happens to them at age 25 or age 30. So inevitably these are old, and so systems do change, but there's also a lot of similarities between what people did 10, 20, 30, even 40, 50 years ago in many countries and what they're doing nowadays. And I need to give some health warnings. Every country has longitudinal data. The data's old. We can't ask new questions. We have to go with what we have already, and then we have to focus on what's most comparable between the different studies. And we have to adjust sometimes for sample size is smalling, and it's complicated. We need to get specialists. So all those health warnings. You can read up all our results here, and I think you'll get copies of these slides. So these are all papers which are on our career readiness website. If you type in OECD career readiness, you'll find all our papers. And this is what we found. What we found is that we could confirm 11 indicators or predictors of better employment outcomes linked to participation in career guidance activities, linked to first-hand experiences of the workforce, and linked to the attitudes that young people expressed about their futures in work as teenagers. So we're looking initially at what happens at 15, and then typically we're looking at 10 years later. Are they earning more than you'd expect? Are they less likely to be unemployed than you'd expect? Are they happier in their job or in their career than you'd expect? And we find in at least 3 countries, and that's our benchmark here, because our studies are also different. We say we've got data from at least 3 countries. We find a universal pattern, a strong pattern across countries being played out. I just want to talk to you a little bit about what we find here. Firstly, if you look at exploring the future, we kind of grouped these deliberately in quite broad ways. We don't want to get too tapped into particular theorizations around guidance, but we see this work as being applicable across the park. And we find here that firstly, activities where young people engage with people in work, through career talks or job fairs, workplace visits or job shadowing, we find there new and strong evidence that these activities have an impact. Occupationally short programs. I'm not sure if these take place in Malta. They're very popular in the United States, in Canada, Australia. These are programs within general education. So within general education, young people might do either academic work, their traditional schooling, and they might do 1 or 2 days of work, 1 or 2 days a week, maybe focus on engineering or on healthcare, broad vocational area, and a lot of employer engagement, enriched by employer engagement in the classroom as well as in the workplace. Interestingly, we find that young people who take part in application and interview skills development activities, so have you done practice interviews, have you learned how to do a resume or a CV, they do better. And career conversations, and this is interesting. We ask young people, we don't, you know, the young people are asked themselves in these surveys, have you spoken to anybody about a job you're interested in, you know, later on? And we find if they say yes, and it might be with teachers, it might be with a guidance counsellor, it might be with a parent or a friend, we find that often we have benefits, you know, later on. And I just want to sort of like, you know, highlight that what we think is happening here may not be so much about the information they receive or the skill they learn, but this is a prompt for them to start thinking about their futures or demonstrate that they are thinking about the futures. Because over here in this column, we find 4 areas where, you know, young people who have clearer views about the sort of job they expect to do, career certainty. If a young person can tell you the type of job they expect to have 10, 15 years later, that's a positive sign. They may change that the next week. It doesn't matter. What it shows you is that they're thinking about their future. They're trying to relate their education and the decisions which they're making to an imagined sense. They're developing a compass for themselves, a sense of direction. We also find that higher ambition is good. We control for the academic ability of young people. We find that higher ambition is, you know, young people with higher ambition do better than young people with lower levels of ambition. Alignment, that's interesting because we see there that young people who, you know, what's aligned here is the occupational plan, their career ambition, and the qualifications typically need to reach that. So, for example, if they say a lawyer, but they're going to leave school as quickly as possible, we see them as misaligned. They're underestimating the level of education that they need to meet their career plans. And you'll see actually an awful lot of young people are misaligned. I'll tell you about that a bit later on. And what we call instrumental motivation, this is actually the ability to draw a connection in between what you're doing in school and your future in work. So if it's tested by statements like working hard at school helped me get a good job, or school is a complete waste of time. And so we can see there that, you know, there's kind of like these relationships, and we think that this thinking, this positive thinking, is the thing which is really most important here. This engaged, critical reflection about a place in the labour market, but it's driven by these sorts of activities here. And then finally, first-hand experiences of the workplace. You know, we see these as being very important. Volunteering is something new. There wasn't a lot of work on this until the last 5 years, but volunteering in the community. And at the bottom of the page is, here are things we probably think. We just don't have enough studies. You know, we just need more studies to be able to have great confidence that these are activities which have a benefit as well. And I'll talk a bit about them as we go through. So these are our 11 indicators. There may well be more, but this is what we've got evidence for. And we've got really hard evidence now, really strong evidence. Because if you see here, I'm not going to go in detail about these next 3 slides because they're going to show you the strength of our evidence and examples of the impact. But you'll see here that, you know, we looked at both our studies and other studies in the literature. How many countries, what percentage of studies, you know, are showing the same thing, that we have significant relationships, you know, with better outcomes. It might be one of those 3, maybe it might be more than one. And I'm just showing off a little bit because what we have in bold here is our new work. That's what we added to the literature. So before our work, you know, the exploration of the future, there wasn't an awful lot to sort of really validate what career guidance counsellors typically do, you know, but now we have a lot more evidence to show what you do really does make a difference. And you'll see here that, you know, we don't always find the evidence, and there might be reasons for that. Programs might be poorly delivered, you know, it might be that something in the statistical analysis misses some aspects because it may only be particular types of young people who end up doing it, and we can't quite work that out. But we find there's a strong pattern. And then you'll see here that, you know, we find in many countries we have these relationships, you know, 9 countries, 7 countries, 8 countries. We're kind of seeing that there's some really strong patterns in some very different countries, you know, so China, Korea, Switzerland, Australia, you know, so we're building up our evidence in a very strong and important way. And this is my opportunity to show a picture of me to you in my football kit, because I think it illustrates what we think is happening here. Because your societies, and around the world are increasingly expecting young people to show personal agency through their transitions. They need to make good decisions themselves. They're staying in education longer than ever before. We ask them to navigate their way, and their families will help them, and their schools will help them. But we're not providing a kind of like a pathway for them often. We're not sort of like directing them. We're saying to them it's their they need to make their decisions. And what we're seeing here is that, these are indicators. These are things that career guidance can do, which really does help young people to make a reality of their agencies, to explore, to experience, to think about their futures, clarifying, confirming, enabling transitions. And what we think is happening here is that young people, who are better placed to understand themselves in relationship to authentic first-hand experiences of the labour market, are better placed to understand parts of the labour market and navigate the way towards them that better fit with their interests and their abilities and their personalities. And when we see higher wages, and I should say that, in higher wages, we're seeing typically higher wages of 5 to 10% at age 25. It's a lot of money, 5 to 10%. When we see that, what we assume is happening here is that there's high productivity because young people are better fit, for the jobs here. And I'll show you this picture here of me in my football kit because I play football every Sunday morning. I've always been a defender, not particularly good, but I've always quite enjoyed it. And then over kind of the last 2 or 3 months, I've been playing in goalkeeper. There's a reason to this. Stay with me. I've been playing in goal. I've been encouraged to do it by people saying you'll be quite good. When I go in for a little while, people are saying, oh yeah, you're all right. They give me some tips about how to do it better. And now I really enjoy it. And I put a lot of time and energy into it, and I'm researching it, and I love being a goalkeeper. 3 months ago, when we picked our teams, I was always pretty much the last to be picked. Now I'm often the first to be picked because people like a goalkeeper. Not many people want to do it. There's demand for me as a goalkeeper, and I'm learning my trade. I'm finding myself as a better fit. And I think something similar happened in sort of like career guidance. We want young people to broaden and extend their imagination and understanding of where they might be, where they might go, and where things are good fits for them. And we kind of see here that this thinking that I was talking about, the certainty, the ambition, the alignment, the instrumental motivation, that ability to draw a connection between education and employment. This is data from PISA. So this is our assessment we do every 3 years, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of young people around the world, and we can look for significant relationships, controlling for their ability through our tests we do, controlling for their background and so on. And we see strong relationships between participation in career guidance activities, seeing a career advisor, having a career conversation, completing a questionnaire, attending a job fair and so on. Young people who do these things are much more likely to have a clearer sense of the job they want to do in the future, higher ambition, an understanding of their education plans, and they match their occupational plans. So, they're planning on getting the right level of qualifications, but also a better place to be able to see a relationship between what they do in the classroom and who they will become. And that must be brilliant for all teachers. If young people, don't agree with statements like school's a waste of time and do agree that working hard at school can help you get a good job. So that's the background. How does Malta compare? Well, it's good and bad news, but quite a lot of good news. Again, I'm using PISA here. And so we use PISA 18. We look at the student experience and attitudes at 15, hundreds of thousands of students around the world, representative samples of young people, a brilliant database. And the first thing I can tell you from this is simply what are the jobs that young Maltese boys and girls expect to do. And we look here and we ask them, do they have an occupational ambition? What type of jobs you expect to do when you're 30? And we can put together the top 10 where their plans are. Sports people here is high for boys. I should tell you, in Argentina, it's #1 choice for boys. Perhaps that's a surprise, but you'll find here that concentration is higher in Malta. Over half of young people, boys and girls, expect to work in 1 of 10 jobs, and that's not a good evidence that the labour market is signalling well for young people. Lower levels of concentration are better, and that's something which perhaps it's not as high. Some countries it's 70 or 80% even, but concentration is high. You see here that ambitions are pretty high as well in Malta. That's a good thing, but we really want young people to have a broader sense of where their careers might take them. going to show you a few slides on some of the data we do have for Malta. Have they completed the questionnaire? Well, Malta, these are the countries which we do have, and I knocked out a few which I thought were less comparable. But in Malta, over half of students by the age of 15 say they've completed the questionnaire and they're interested in abilities. That's better than some countries, not as good as others. But I'd really argue, it should be 100% in all these countries. Young people should be, completing these sorts of, questionnaires, whether in paper or online, where they reflect upon, their interests. Sometimes their psychological predispositions, either more extroverted or introverted, in order to be able to see relationships between, kind of personalities and different job types and so on. If we look about researching the internet for information about careers, this is something that often happens outside of the classroom. Young Maltese are pretty good. They are thinking about this, but we find that many young people aren't at all. They're not even researching the internet by age 15, by which stage, they're, again, towards the end, often they're compulsory secondary education. And, we really want them to be thinking seriously about the next stages. If we look about have they spoken to a career advisor, either in or out of school, Malta does very well. Over, about 3/4 of young Maltese, do speak to a career advisor in or out of school. Now, we don't know, if that's one short conversation. We don't know if it's a series of conversation. We don't know if the young person thought it was helpful to them or not. But you see in many countries that just happen at all. And even in Malta, for 1/4 of students by the age of 15, they say they haven't spoken to anybody or a career advisor about their futures. And so by the age of 15, it's getting quite late, because it gets difficult for young people to adjust their engagement in education, thinking about how hard they're going to study certain things, maybe what subjects they're going to focus on or choose, where they're going to go. And we really need them to have this information really quite early on, so they can make best use of their time in education. It's really a golden time for them. After they leave education, everything's much more difficult. This is important. If you look at who in Malta has been more likely to speak to a career guidance counsellor. Now, in some countries, we find that it's the higher performers and the most advantaged, the top quarter social-economic status students, who are more likely to gain career guidance interventions. And also in Malta, that's good. That's a really good sign, because young people, particularly the lower performers, are more likely to enter the labour market earlier, and we really want to make sure that they are supported, as they go out of education and into work, to have some real choices, to understand the pathways, vocational education, other, further education, and make the best of their integration into the labour market. So that's good. But again, as I say, we really want to have everybody in the sample having spoken to guidance counsellors by this age. We also have data for participation in things like career fairs, and congratulations here, Malta, you are top of the list, and that's great. Doing career fairs, job fairs is something which we see in our indicators as something which has got real value for young people. But I would just, as an aside here, firstly, kind of highlight this is more level in terms of who's participating, but we do find it's the lower performers, the more disadvantaged students, were less likely to go to job fairs. Not a big difference, but there is a difference, and we would hope that it'll be kind of the other way around. But just as a little aside, thinking about job fairs, well, the aim of them is to helping people broaden their career thinking, to engage with multiple people from different economic backgrounds, and to inform their career thinking, getting information about how to progress well. But we find, and I've done it in job fairs, you see students walking around in groups of friends. They may be unwilling to explore areas which they don't really understand. They may be influenced by their friends who all go around in a group. I like this model in Australia, where some schools ask older students to put on career fairs for younger students. Now, that doesn't replace ones where you get to encounter people in work, firsthand. But I think it's a really nice idea, because for the older people, the older student, it prompts them to reflect on what they've been learning through their first-hand encounters with the labour market and their own research. But I think we should group job fairs with a number of other activities in career talks, guest speakers coming into school, And if the guest speakers are coming into the school, we can be more confident that the students will hear them, that they will sort of like engage. They can't escape sometimes. But what we really like, and this is a paper here which does some testing to see how students respond to the different approaches, the job fair, the career talk, the career carousel. What we find is that in a career carousel, the students think that this is the most effective way of encountering people in work. You have small groups of students, a bit like you're sat today at different tables. You'd have somebody from a different vocational background, a different job, sat at different tables. The students move around. And when they do that in groups of maybe 3 or 4, it's very hard for them to disengage and not concentrate. It's much easier for them to ask questions. It's you can do over an hour. You could do 6-10-minute sessions or 10 6-minute sessions, and I think activities like that can be really effective in making sure we get the most out of our engagement with with people in work to broaden and inform career thinking. Looking now at job shadowing, workplace visits, again, sort of like Malta does well. And these are really important. I'm super interested in job shadowing at the moment. So if you run a job shadowing program in your school, I'd love to talk to you about how you do it, because I think other schools could really learn about job shadowing. Workplace visits are particularly important from an early age. You can take classes around workplaces to help them really understand, and draw a connection between what they do in school and who they might become. But if we look at who gets the most, this is good news. We want lower performers to be doing this more often. We want it's better that young people from socially disadvantaged backgrounds are getting more, because they're less likely to have the resources at home from a wide variety of different backgrounds. Their parents might less likely to be sort of managers or are able to sort of like get favors from people to help young people gain access to useful resources and useful experiences, maybe like a work placement or a job shadow. So this is good. And then if we look at some of these attitudes around career thinking, we look at uncertainty. In Malta, young people are less likely to be uncertain, and that is good. Low levels of uncertainty is a good thing. In some countries, you see it's really very high. Over a third of students at 15 can't tell you, the sort of job would they expect to do by age of 30. And I should say, it doesn't matter if they change their mind the next week. What this tells us is that they're trying to kind of solve the problem. They're trying to grapple with their sense of where they are, where they might become, and that prompts them to think about the journey they want to take, to help them to visualize and plan their futures. They need to have a sense of a future in order to be able to do that. And now here come the problems for Malta. If you look who's most uncertain, well, firstly, it tends to be boys are more uncertain. Kids from more disadvantaged backgrounds, particularly low performers. So 25% of low performers are uncertain. So we give them the tests in PISA on reading, maths, and science, and we can group the children by how well they perform those tests. And those tests are good indicators for how well young people do in other standardized tests. So low performers we have a problem with, foreign-born students in Malta, low-performing boys in particular. So nearly a third of low-performing boys can't tell you, at this age. And then, as a particular subgroup, low-performing foreign-born boys, 40%, can't tell you what sort of job they expect to do. If you look at misalignment, and so misalignment is this, we test this by asking young people what's the job they want to do. Young people tend to be very ambitious these days, so often half or more of them say they're going to become a manager or professional. And these are jobs in most countries people need a university education to do. And then we ask them if they're planning to go to university, and if they say no, we see them as misaligned. They have high career ambitions, but they're not planning to go to university. It doesn't mean you can't do it, but it's a useful indicator. And in Malta we have, it's relatively similar to other countries, but around a quarter of students we could say they are misaligned. High ambitions for their jobs, but not high ambitions for their education. But again, if we look at who it is, who is most likely to be misaligned, social disadvantage plays into it, but the lower performers, nearly half of lower performers have high ambitions, but aren't planning to go to university. Well, maybe in Malta they can get these jobs, these professional jobs, managerial jobs, without going to university. Maybe it's something about the labour market, but that's not what the high performers think. The high performers are planning to go to university. And we can control sometimes. So I haven't got the figures for Malta here, but we can control for their ability. Are they high performers or low performers? And then we look at social class, social background, and we find typically in countries that young people from disadvantaged backgrounds who perform just as well as people from advantaged backgrounds are much less ambitious in their plans. So I'm going to come towards the end now, and I'm going to give you just a few examples of some programs which we're aware of, which we think might help, further enhance the provision which you have in Malta. Firstly, we argue that it's really important to begin career guidance early, and that means primary school. And this is because what we see is really driving, the positive changes which we're seeing from these young people is their attitudes, their assumptions, their expectations, how they think about their futures. And that thinking, doesn't start at 14 or 15, and it shouldn't do. If you're not getting the guidance until that point, you're not being prompted by your school to really think about it by that point, it's very, very easy to drift kind of through education and see maybe education as an end in itself. And clearly, education is for lots of purposes, and it's not only about getting a job, but getting a job is really important. It is really important, and we see that different young people have different access to different resources through their family network, and we want to equalise that and make it a bit more fair for everybody. And beginning at primary is really important. Now, at primary, it's not the same as career guidance at secondary school, but at primary it is about broadening kind of expectations. Sometimes it's about raising aspirations and raising expectations. It's about helping young people to draw a connection between what they're doing in education and who they might become later on. How do people use maths, or how do people use different subjects in their work? Primary Futures is a great program, very popular in the UK and New Zealand. And groups of volunteers from different workplaces come in, and the children guess what jobs they do. So it's very, very effective for helping to challenge some of the stereotyping. You get, can women become engineers? Do men work in childcare? You get young people to see people for themselves. There's something very powerful of meeting and engaging with somebody who is a female firefighter or a female pilot, to show young people, well, actually women do these jobs, and it is possible. And you start setting seeds early on to broaden their understanding and broaden their thinking about who they are, who they might become, and that allows them in secondary school to make the most of it, to think far more critically and engaged, to show the sorts of agency and control which we want to see. Now later on, the school to group work method in Finland is a lovely program, 20 hours, final year of education. Groups of students do a whole series of activities to prepare them for this transition as they go into kind of the labour market. And in that, they meet an employer. They try and learn how to think like an employer. They do some practice interviews. They work as a group, which is really important, because it's important that young people are encouraged and enabled to have a social process to continually talking and thinking about their plans. And that's a program which is seen to improve employment outcomes, but also importantly to improve psychological outcome. Young people have better psychological well-being if they have a better understanding and preparation for their transition. I really like Speed Meet in New Zealand as well. Over an hour, individual students, older students, work around a room, 6 tables, 6 employers, and they get to meet people. And they or maybe 10 employers over an hour. And it's a great way to for employers to find people for apprenticeships. It's a great way for them to find people who they might hire. It's a great way for them to get information in a friendly and supportive environment, which they can use to develop themselves. And I really like these occupationally focused short programs, and I'm not sure how it fits within Malta. It might not fit very well at all with the way education is set up there. But 1 or 2 days a week from 15, 16, 17, 18, young people have effectively delivered a kind of a pathway, an introduction to a vocational area. They're gaining first-hand experiences of the labour market. They're sometimes getting accreditation or certification. It might be for forklift truck driving. It might be a health and safety issue. It might be something which actually gives them a foot already in the labour market while they're still in education. And we find that that's very motivating kind of for young people. It's very enriching in terms of their education, but they're not being, narrowly focused, driven down a vet route, they're still doing their general education as well. They're still keeping their options open at 14, 15, 16. And there's some lovely programs which you see around the world, which are very popular, I think, with young people and increasingly with employers. So by way of conclusion, I want to share with you that we now have new evidence from multiple countries that show that guidance has a central role to play in enabling better employment outcomes for youth. Now, importantly, many of these longitudinal studies took place over the great financial crisis. And so we see that even in periods of economic turbulence, periods of economic problems, that guidance can still be relied upon to support young people. There are these 11 new indicators, new predictors, which we'd see at the heart of effective guidance. We know that often too few students are career ready. We know that it's really important, to begin early, because attitudes are a really good guide to show whether guidance is working, and we can test those. We can ask students about their ambitions. We can ask them about their plans, and we can give them more interventions if we feel we need to. Clearly, these indicators highlight the importance of employer engagement. Should be at the heart of effective guidance. First-hand experiences as well. I haven't talked much about that, but volunteering, part-time work, as well as work placement. And maybe volunteering part-time work sometimes feel more authentic and more useful for young people. And our effective systems will encourage, enable, and require students to think critically, continually about their futures in work. That's what we want to do. That's really what we want to do from a young age, really creating this culture of curiosity, investigation, open, discursive, exploring with each other, making it something which is a whole school activity. Now, obviously, we've got more work to do, always more work to do, but I think now we have a really solid set of new data which we can use. You'll find here on this website all our papers. This one here, which you'll find at the top, is very accessible, lots of infographics, a summary of all our results, but also we did short papers on things like workplace experience and career conversations and application skills, interview skills, and so on, looking at practice from around the world and sharing that, as well as sharing the evidence we have from other research papers, as well as our own. So I'm going to finish there. I'm going to tell you that our continuing work will look at international practice linked to these indicators, but also we're very interested in the use of digital technologies in guidance. We think that's got a great capacity to enhance the effectiveness, the efficiency, the equity by which guidance is delivered. And we're really interested in guidance to enable and support access to green jobs and inequalities. And these are areas we're going to be focusing on over the next 2 years. And I should just say again, we're very interested in job shadowing and career talks, guest speakers coming into schools. And so if that's something you do and you've got a program which you really like and you think works, well, get in contact. We'd love to talk to you about what you do, why you do it, how it works. You can stay in touch with us. We have a free monthly newsletter. Send an email to that address there, and we're very accessible. And I should just say to you, congratulations on your results. Clearly in Malta, there's a lot going well compared to other countries, but as always, and as everywhere, there's still much more to do. So thank you very much, and thank you for your time today, and good luck with the rest of the conference today.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mann, for such an in-depth lecture on what works in the career guidance. We really appreciated your most valid contribution to our conference this morning. And before we disconnect, may I kindly ask whether there are any questions we can put to Dr. Mann from the floor. Are there any questions? It was really a very interesting lecture on where we stand in our guidance for our students to prepare them for their career. So I thank you, Dr. Mann. We won't keep you any further. Thank you very much. Any questions? You have a question, right?
Hi. Good morning, Dr. Mann. Thank you for being with us. And first of all, on behalf of the Ministry for Education, we would like to thank you for your time in preparing for this presentation today and the many meetings that Stephen had with you to prepare for this conference. I just wanted to ask you a question. You know, my interest in extending career guidance in the primary sector. how important do you think is it that we should start teaching students, that we should start sensitizing students to the world of work, to also certain employability skills, starting from the primary? Very often we find even educators who sort of question this, and they would tell us, isn't this too early? It's not the age for students to start choosing their career. What do you think about this emphasis? There is research which shows that starting career guidance early is helpful. What is your expertise about this?
Well, thank you for the question, and thank you too for helping me to prepare a good presentation for today. It's really helpful to me to be in contact with colleagues at the Ministry of Education in Malta, because in my job I'm looking for really interesting and innovative and effective approaches, and a lot of what you do in Malta is very good. And it's great to be able to share and understand what you do with other countries. I think there's a very strong case for beginning guidance in primary school, a very strong case. And it's not just me, it's positioned across the OECD. And I think other international organizations, which work with multiple countries would agree as well. And I'll tell you some reasons, and I'll give you some examples of the sorts of practice, which I think is the sort of things we should be thinking about for primary school. Now, one is that there's a paper which the OECD put out maybe about 2 years ago, and it's based on a survey of the career plans of 5-year-olds. Okay, so they're 5, very young 5-year-olds. They asked 5-year-olds, what sort of job do you think you have when you're a grown-up, when you're an adult? And there's a few things there. One is that 5-year-olds do think about jobs. They don't say they're going to be a superhero or a fairy or their mum or their dad. They actually do think about this and do have an imagination. They've already started thinking. Okay, that's one thing. Second thing though is a lot of their thoughts about this are very heavily influenced by their gender. And so we see, actually sometimes more for boys than for girls, but for large numbers of both sides are thinking in very traditional terms about what's right and natural for a boy or a girl to aspire to later on in life. And thirdly, we find actually a lot of similarity between what they say at 5 and what they say at 13 or at 15. There is a lot of doctors, a lot of vets, a lot of engineers, a lot of car mechanics, a lot of traditional ideas and thoughts. And because there is such continuity, and because, as we argue, and I think our evidence shows very powerfully, that what young people think about the future is really so important, we need to start from a young age in helping them to draw these connections, to think about the relationship between their education and who they might become. And so effective programs at primary, I don't think we should. So if I get young people to make a decision at 5 and stick to it, and then support them towards that as a pathway, progression, so later on. But what we should do is, encourage this culture of curiosity. There's a program in Australia which has just started called Little Ripples, and it creates little cards with a series of questions. We encourage parents to speak to their children about the subjects they use, how they use their subjects in their work, so they can see some of these relationships, help them to show them that career development is a social process, having a series of questions, as well as for primary futures. I think that's a lovely program as well. We see in England where you bring people into the classroom, we kind of challenge some of those stereotypes which come out of our society and are really, really damaging. Because if you really do need to know at a young age, if there are particular subjects going to be particularly valuable to you. You need to check whether it's right for you, to emerge, to think about yourself, your adult identity in construction or in marketing or so on. And this takes time to check, and so we need to give young people plenty of time. And then a final study which just came out. This is from the UK. It was amongst university students, probably about 20,000 university students. And they were asked when they first started thinking about whether they would go to university or not. And they were also asked a whole series of other questions, but one of them was how happy they were with their choice of a university course. And there's a strong correlation between beginning to think about this at primary school. You know, the earlier you think, the longer you have to really sort of like reflect, to get the information you need. You know, these processes are slow. Through your school, even if you have a really good career guidance program, it may only be sort of like 2 or 3 times a year. You might have the opportunity to meet somebody, you know, from a profession which you're interested in, to really explore in a supported way. So I think we really do need to start primary, and I think there are sort of like, you know, there are ways we can do it. And I would note that in the UK there's a bill for Parliament at the moment, an education bill, which would make a form of guidance, like I've been talking about, something which is systematic across primary schools in the UK. And we see in a wider range of countries that primary is seen as a place where you start this, not in the same way, but with similar objectives, which is to equip a young person, you know, kind of with the knowledge, the information, the confidence to, you know, to really use their education to develop for themselves a profile which will allow them to go to a place in the labour market where they will feel at their happiest, where they will feel most fulfilled, as is possible. And so there are some great programs around the world, some great ones in California as well, and I would certainly encourage that as an area within Malta.
Good morning, Dr. Mann. Thank you again for the presentation, and thank you for these results. It will encourage us to continue to work. I have one question, because yesterday we were seeing your presentation, Dorian and I, and we were not in agreement on one of your slides, slide 34, where you compare thinking about the future career uncertainty, whether Malta is faring well or not, because Dorian and I didn't agree if it is a good result or not. So I wanted to clarify this with you.
Yeah, I mean, I think really we need to look at all the results in the round, and you only have some of the results, you know, which from our data here. So we have you know, sort of like a kind of like a range of information, and in 40 minutes there's only so much which I can share. And you know, some indicators are looking better, some indicators are looking worse, but we look at everything in the round. I think that's the important thing. So we shouldn't pick out one or two too much. But in terms of the uncertainty, you know, I think our figure for Malta is somewhere between 15 and 20% in terms of the level of uncertainty. Now, you know, ideally you need to have a number of studies with young people, some snapshots over the time. But uncertainty, you know, there can be circumstances. There's 1 or 2 studies which show that uncertainty isn't always a penalty for young people. Overwhelmingly, studies show that it is a penalty, that if you can't name a job which you expect to do, you know, so in adulthood, you know, you always do, you know, you can always expect to do worse than you'd expect given your qualifications and background and so on. And the circumstances where it has been found that it's not such a penalty. It tends to be much very high performers. It tends to be more middle class students. It tends to be students who get good career guidance, to say they've had good career guidance, and they're keeping their options open. You know, they may be going to a prestigious university, and then they will decide later on. Well, you know, that applies to some students, but not for most students. And you know, we always see some uncertainty because students, you know, will inevitably change their ideas. Studies suggest that having backup plans, having 2 or 3 aspirations is a good one, and that, you know, thinking about 2 or 3 different areas at any one time, you know, is a good thing to see. Compared to other countries, you know, yet fewer young people are uncertain than in Malta than in other countries. But we find that those students who are uncertain are probably the ones who should be most worried about, because I'm not sure what age compulsory schooling ends in Malta, what year you can leave education and go into work. If you're a low performer in the PISA tests, the likelihood of you going into the labour market, leaving education, is going to be quite high. And we find amongst those students that there's very high levels of uncertainty. And that would be a concern. So I think there's good news and bad news on that indicator.
Any more questions, please? Right. Thank you very much again, Dr. Mann. Another question? Oh, over there. Yes, please. Sorry, Dr. Mann.
Morning. Have you ever considered studying if there is any relation between career guidance and students who drop or change their university studies, if there is any relation at all?
Yeah, good question. It's not something which we've looked at recently. You know, this relationship between dropping out at university. I would expect that there is a strong relationship. I don't have the evidence to hand. It's the sort of relationship we would expect to see, that, you know, young people who feel they didn't have good guidance, or that you know, they're more likely to make a mistake. It's tricky because I'm aware of a couple of studies where you ask them, you know, when they're 20 and they've just dropped out, whether they felt they had good guidance, and they tend to say, I didn't. And so, well, you know, maybe, you know, that's a bit contaminated, you know, by their immediate experiences. What we really need to know is at 15 or 16, did they say the guidance they had was good and sufficient? Are they getting plentiful guidance? And I think it's a really good example of way of showing that, you know, kind of the return on investment on guidance. That if young people are dropping out, you know, whether it's an apprenticeship or it's a higher education course, then that's a waste of public money. It's very damaging for themselves individually. They're having to restart, they're wasting time, and these costs are very high. And I think, you know, this is exactly the sort of area where we can really sort of like deepen our understanding, not only about, you know, what works and why it works, but also what the costs are and what the savings are. And if we reduce that dropout by 5%, 10% through better guidance, you know, we can see savings, you know, for an economy over a long period of time. And then suddenly, you know, it becomes much easier to make a case for, you know, guidance, an investment in guidance at a higher level or the same level or a lower level, because you have a stronger sense about what's gained through having really good guidance in schools.
Any more questions, please? Another one.
Good morning, Dr. Mann. On behalf of the Directorate for Learning and Assessment, I would like to show my appreciation and say thank you for the presentation and for sharing with us your insights. It has certainly given us some food for thought. And we look forward to hosting you in Malta, perhaps sometime in the near future, and show you around our schools where you can see for yourself how much we are catering for this career development and learning and guidance and our services. We work very closely as a directorate with Ms. Gershi's directorate as well. It would be, I think, an enriching experience to show you around, especially all the workshops that we have, which are meant to inspire careers of the future. Thank you.
Oh, well, thank you. It'd be a real pleasure. I love the opportunity to go to schools. I love to see sort of like practice, and it's always wonderful to be able to speak to the students and the guidance counsellors. And I hope we can manage that sometime.
Surely you'll be most welcome, Dr. Mann. Any more questions, please? Would that do? Thank you again, Dr. Mann. It's been a pleasure having you with us this morning. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you.
Have a pleasant day. Thank you.
You too. Bye-bye.
Diskorsa sew interessanti minn Dr. Anthony Mann, kellim internazzjonali tal-OECD, bla dubda xejn tana diversi punti x'nixtarru b'mod partikolari dawk fil-settur edukattiv, iktar u iktar dawk li huma sintendi mitħlaw xogħol tagħhom u l-missjoni tagħhom hija li jippreparaw lill-istudenti tagħna għall-karrieri. Hawnhekk se nifu għal ftit mumenti, nikkalkulaw madwar nofsija għal kafe, però qabel għandi avviż żgħir iżda importanti.